In 2002, Pope John Paul II published a long poem called Roman Triptych.
The undulating wood slopes down to the rhythm of mountain streams. To me, this rhythm is revealing you, the eternal Word. How amazing is your silence in everything, in all that on every side unveils the world of creation about us, all that, like the undulating wood, runs down every slope, all that is carried along by the stream's silvery cascade, rhythmically falling from the mountain, carried by its own current. Carried where?
This is the first poem that John Paul II has published since becoming Pope 25 years ago. As Karol Wojtyla, student, priest, bishop, archbishop and cardinal, the Pope wrote a lot of poetry. I'm Wendy Barnaby, and in this encounter we'll explore his verse, what it says about the man and his beliefs, and the impact it's had. Most people are surprised to discover that John Paul II writes poetry. But his biographer, George Weigel, says that poetry has been important in his life.
It's played a large role in the Pope's life at different moments in his life. The Pope is a man of a genuine mystical sensibility and intuition, and he's also a literary man who finds different literary forms appropriate for the expression of different insights. I think poetry for the Pope is a way of describing his religious experience, describing his moral experience, describing his experience of the drama of the human condition, in a way that the sharp, natural images that recur time and again in his poetry, that the somewhat broken or disjointed nature of a modern poetic style lends itself to. He's trying to communicate experiences which can only be evoked in others. You can't describe them discursively the way you would describe a football match. You can only try to evoke those same experiences in others through the interplay of word and emotion. And I think that's what he's trying to do in poetry, and that's in fact what all great religious lyric poets do.
His poetry is blank verse, first of all. It doesn't rhyme, but it has very beautiful rhythm.
Krzysztof Sonek, a Polish Dominican priest currently studying in Oxford.
We can discover this rhythm even in the English translation, which was done by Jerzy Peterkiewicz, professor of Polish literature at King's College in London. The second feature of his poetry is that this is a sort of meditative poetry. The Pope, Karol Wojtyla in the past and now the Pope, he ponders on different aspects of life, such as love, marriage, God, faith, human fate, whatever. He ponders these different aspects and shares his thoughts and his views.
And these have matured through a turbulent time in Polish history. Jonathan Luxmore is a journalist who specialises in European church news and who's lived for many years in Poland. He says we should see Karol Wojtyla as a child of his time.
He was born in the year that Poland was very narrowly saved from disaster at the so-called miracle on the Vistula when Marshal Pilsudski's Polish legions defeated the invading Red Army. So this sort of crisis year is the year in which he's born. He grows up, he goes to school in the 1920s with the sort of tensions with the local Jewish community, the sort of development of extreme ideological positions that are beginning to sort of emerge even in his hometown of Wadowice among school children and so forth, and then goes to Krakow as a student where these tensions begin to be played out in the years leading up to World War II. The principal political tension in Poland in the late 1930s was between what one can broadly describe as a sort of right-wing nationalist camp and the sort of left-wing socialist communist ideas that were coming partly from Germany, partly from the Soviet Union. And these were the sort of principal pressures that were beginning to surface, particularly at the Jagiellonian University, where the Pope was a student, and actually were expressed in day-to-day events. I mean, sort of punch-ups between sort of the Socialist League of Students and the right-wing nationalist Falanga, as it was called. And I think somebody whose youth was spent in such an atmosphere could not fail to be particularly affected by the sort of drama of choices that people were facing, which way to go, who to listen to, who to believe.
Through all this time, Karol Wojtyla was writing poetry and plays, the poetry under pen names. Bolesław Toborski is a distinguished Polish poet who has translated Wojtyla's plays into English. He says Wojtyla was always a poet.
The poetry was in him from the start, I suppose. Even at school, he was writing something, but these poems have not survived. But when he was a student at the University of Krakow, at 18, he wrote poetry which, with a few of his colleagues, he recited at a public reading. During the war, he continued with it. At that time, he had experiences which not many people have at that age. He was both a student at a clandestine university. He was an actor also. It was a clandestine group called the Rhapsodic Theatre. And above all, this is very important for the direction that his poetry was to take in the future. He was a physical worker. He worked in a quarry.
One of the features of his poetry is that it's quite opaque and not very accessible. We have to make some effort in order to really understand what he means. When you go to Poland, people will tell you an anecdote. One of the present Pope's books he published when he was Archbishop of Krakow is entitled The Acting Person. And you know, once the Archbishop of Krakow went to a small town and visited a parish, and afterwards he dined with some priests. And one of these priests, probably his close friends, was teasing the Archbishop in a very friendly way. So Karol Wojtyla said, "My dear, I think that when you die, you will not go directly to heaven, but to purgatory." So the priest answered, "Oh yes, I will go to purgatory, and I know very well what I will do there." "What will you do there?" asked Wojtyla. "I will have to read The Acting Person as my penance."
Krzysztof Sonek. Although most people do find the poetry difficult, parishioners of St. Peter's Catholic Church in Winchester were immediately drawn to an early poem. It's called Later Recollection of the Meeting. It's part of a longer poem about the meeting between Christ and the Samaritan woman at the well, which ended with Christ telling her to go and sin no more. The Samaritan woman is recalling the meeting.
To see like this, inwardly, none of us dares. His recognition was different. He hardly raised his eyes. He was a great gathering of perception, like the well blowing the brightness of water into a face. He had a mirror, like the well, shining deep. He saw me in himself, possessed me in himself. He suffused me with ease, burst my shame in me, and the thoughts I'd suppressed for so long. He was whole in my sin and my secret.
Moira Redmond was enthusiastic about this poem.
She says, "He was whole in my sin and my secret." And she's talking about her shame, that she felt that he saw into her soul and saw that in her soul and helped her to fight. But it's not a simplistic poem. It's not saying, "Oh, and I met him and suddenly everything was okay." It's basically saying, kind of, he gave me the tools to fight sin and evil. And it just very much impressed me, that. I thought that it said something about what it must have been like to meet somebody incredibly charismatic and powerful, whether or not you believe in him as God or the Son of God, a meeting that she can't get out of her mind afterwards, a feeling that something touched her, something came to her. And I thought it was a very powerful description of that, and I really, really liked that poem.
You're listening to Encounter with me, Wendy Barnaby. We're exploring the Pope's poetry. In all his work, Karel Wojtyla sees the people he writes about in relation to God. This is very striking in a series of poems from 1957 called Profiles of a Cyrenian. Polish poet and translator Bolesław Toborski.
He sees this Simon of Cyrene, the chance passerby forced to carry Christ's cross, very apt for our time. He says that we are all Simons of Cyrene carrying crosses that we do not want. And he shows this on the example of 14 chosen profiles. And some are self-evident. Melancholic, schizoid, people with psychological problems, but also the blind. Girl disappointed in love. Very interesting choice.
Yes, what do you think he's saying there? It seemed to me he was saying, you think you're unhappy, but you must look at your unhappiness in the context of Christ's unhappiness, and frankly, you're not in the race.
Absolutely. You're right there.
I just wondered how a young girl who had been disappointed in love would receive that. On the face of it, it's not a very sympathetic sort of poem.
Not well at first, but maybe later on reflection,
yes,
she'll find something there.
With mercury we measure pain, as we measure the heat of bodies and air. But this is not how to discover our limits. You think you are the centre of things. If you could only grasp that you are not, the centre is he, and he, too, finds no love. Why don't you see?
Most people are going to say, you're a celibate man. You do not understand what a young girl disappointed in love is going through. It's a hard thing to say about somebody, but perhaps he doesn't understand what it's like to be a young girl disappointed in love. And I felt it was slightly patronising that she was going to say, what do you know about it? You know, I've got my heart broken. Don't try it on with me. But it wasn't even the way your friend might say to you, don't worry about it, it's okay, another guy will be along, God's more important. You might take that for a friend, but truly you're not going to take it from an older man, especially not one who's a priest.
Moira Redmond. Another of these Cyrenian profiles is called Children.
Growing unawares through love, of a sudden they've grown up, and hand in hand wander in crowds, their hearts caught like birds, profiles pale in the dusk. The pulse of mankind beats in their hearts. On a bank by the river, holding hands, a tree stump in moonlight, the earth a half-whisper, the children's hearts rise over the water. Will they be changed when they get up and go? Or look at it this way, a goblet of light tilted over a plant reveals unknown inwardness. Will you be able to keep from spoiling what has begun in you? Will you always separate the right from the wrong?
I like reading these poems to the children, simply because it's much easier to use his words other than my own. And I know that they'll give me a response in a much more honest way, rather than be intimidated by having to be what they might term as soppy towards me as a mother.
Eva Slin, a Polish member of St. Peter's Congregation.
It's much easier to communicate about difficult issues. Good and bad, right and wrong. Yes, there is that essence in you and what you are longing for that matters. And my children get very fed up with me talking about longings, but I think it is such an important thing. And that is what he also talks about, I feel, through his poetry. Or that's how he presents himself in the poetry. It's not so much about who you are or what you can or cannot do. It's about what you long for in terms of becoming. I went to university in Warsaw in 1962, I believe it was. I was studying English philology at the time, so you could say I was interested in literature and poetry. And the Pope's poetry, I guess, offered a different dimension to the poetry that was available, or easily available, I should say, because of the religious context. Religious poetry was not something that was published. All the publishing was done by the state, so to speak, and religious texts were not encouraged. And so his texts were circulated usually among us. Somebody would have typed them up. They were circulated among young people, and they offered maybe an involvement in a spiritual dimension.
Evers Lynn. Religion was difficult to practice under the communist regime in Poland. Wojciech Plazak has observed the country closely. For over 30 years he's worked at the Polish section of the BBC World Service and has often accompanied the Pope on his travels. He saw how the communists treated the church.
The communists in Poland never denied the existence of religion as such, because it was a very strong reality visible everywhere. But they've changed its context. God was dead, therefore religion was dead. Religion could be tolerated as some sort of activity akin to summer solstice, some sort of ritual which has no meaning, or the meaning had been lost. Religious practices were allowed as long as they were rather shallow. And now that's the real role of Karol Wojtyła and his poetry and his other writings, and not only poetry. He wanted to show, first of all, God as being very much alive. That was his challenge to communism. And he did it on many levels. To start with, of course, in his sermons, in his everyday pastoral work, in encouraging the building of churches where they couldn't be built, like in new towns, so-called workers' towns, without churches, and so on. But also, it is one of the main themes of his poems, God as being very relevant, God as being the leading force. Whatever the social political system, that was the real challenge. And that's why very early on some communists realized he was very dangerous. He was, of course, being investigated and followed and so on. He had that uncanny vision, what was needed at that moment most.
The Quarry is a poem which is steeped in the conviction that God is alive and goes further to make a political point. Poet and translator Bolesław Toborski.
It's a very significant work because it was written in 1956 after the workers in Poznań rioted against the communist authorities, and 50 or so of them were killed when tanks came out into the street. And Karol Wojtyła recalls the period 16 years earlier when he worked in the quarry and was a witness to an accident when a worker was killed. But metaphorically, he relates it to the death of workers in Poznań. So he's making a political point without engaging in politics. He opposes himself to the Stalinist axiom that The present generation of workers has to sacrifice everything for the future generations. And because, he says, every man is unique and can't be treated in this way.
He wasn't alone. His muscles grew into the flesh of the crowd, energy their pulse, as long as they held a hammer, as long as his feet felt the ground. And a stone smashed his temples and cut through his heart's chamber. They took his body and walked in a silent line. Who will lift up that stone, unfurl his thoughts again under the cracked temples? So plaster cracks on the wall. They laid him down, his back on a sheet of gravel. His wife came, worn out with worry. His son returned from school. Should his anger now flow into the anger of others? It was maturing in him through its own truth and love. Should he be used by those who come after, deprived of substance, unique and deeply his own? The stone's on the move again, a wagon bruising the flowers. Again the electric current cuts deep into the walls. But the man has taken with him the world's inner structure, where the greater the anger, the higher the explosion of love.
That's exactly what happened in Poland politically. You had the accumulation of anger. This is one of the visions, building up of anger within people. And there something has to give. And communism had to give.
Wojciech Plazak. You're listening to Encounter with me, Wendy Barnaby. We're exploring the Pope's poetry. For Ewa Lynn at the University of Warsaw in the 60s, Wojtylja's poems were very important.
It gave us courage, I would say, in a simple way. Courage to have faith. Courage to be proud of who we were. It introduced us to maybe connecting the social aspect of living with the biblical aspect. It made, again, it introduced this whole historical issue, which he is very, very familiar with. And maybe from him I also gathered this idea of us being a product of history. We are now only because of what had happened before. His early poetry has got the Polish landscape very, very visible. It's got the unfortunate part of our history. It's got this whole chunk when we didn't exist on the map of 180 years, when we were partitioned as a country. Yet the traditions, the awareness of who we were survived and was very, very strong.
Wojtylja's poem Thinking My Country is patriotic, but, as Bolesław Tobolski explains, not in any sense nationalistic.
It's a celebration of his homeland and its beauty, but also it's not a facile statement how wonderful we Poles are. No, there is a harsh remembrance of the fact that Poland had lost her independence in the past, largely due to the abuse of freedom by its ruling class. And it also contained important warnings and words of encouragement to people still ruled by unwanted communist authorities. Freedom is very important and necessary, but it must not be abused. And freedom is not something that we have for all time. Let me quote directly from the poem. Freedom has
continually to be won. It cannot merely be possessed. It comes as a gift, but can only be kept with a struggle. Gift and struggle are written into pages, hidden yet open. You pay for your freedom with all your being. Therefore call this your freedom, that paying for it continually you possess yourself anew. Weak is a people that accepts defeat, forgetting that it was sent to keep watch till the coming of its hour, and the hours keep returning on the great clock face of history.
As it turned out, these were prophetic words. Karol Wojtyla was elected Pope in 1978. In 1979 he came back to visit Poland, a visit which, as the BBC's Wojciech Plazak explained, came at a very difficult time for the country.
The nation was very tired. People tried on occasions in previous years between 56, which was the first larger movement of anger against the communist authorities, till 76, 79. Some people were dispirited. Some people were losing hope. And then suddenly something like this happens. A Pole is elected Pope, and he comes back. That's important thing, because people didn't know what would he do. Now he's far away, and now he does come back, and he does come back with a message: do not abandon hope. In the contrary, have more hope than ever, because the hour of liberation is very near. And people didn't know what's liberation, where everything's failed. Communism is too strong, not in our children's lifetime probably. What galvanized people really who were there was that he turned into prayer suddenly, having said a lot of things and having reminded a lot of Polish history to the people, again, good things from Polish history, uplifting. And then he, with a very dramatic gesture, turned to prayer, almost calling out, Holy Spirit, descend and change the face of this land.
Eva Slin was in Poland at the time of that visit.
People did extraordinary things at the time. People walked for hundreds of miles.
To hear him.
Yes. People spontaneously walked. People felt free to show their faith openly. But it was this whole Poland on the move. It was one of those moments in history which touches you in a very happy way, that is liberating. And yet nobody tells anybody what to do. People just know. It's that explosion, I think, of goodness in people, of explosion of happiness. Looking back, I think it had changed a lot. People stopped being afraid. I think it led to solidarity. Solidarity as such was already forming for years. There was a great movement underground, but it strengthened the ordinary people. It made them more determined. And I also believe it gave shape to the type of movement it became, the fact that it was so peaceful. People knew that they were right. And if it took for the next 10 years for it to bear fruit, let it be. They were convinced it just has to happen, whatever the freedom was at the time. And I think he was, as some people disagree with me, of course, I think he was fundamental to that movement.
Through all the vicissitudes of life, The Church has stood as a spiritual bastion for John Paul II. Dominican priest Christoph Sonek points to some poems in which the Pope expresses his feelings about the Church.
There are two beautiful poems written by Archbishop of Krakow, Karol Wojtyła, when he was a member of the Second Vatican Council, so he wrote these poems in the 60s. The first poem is entitled Marble Floor, and the future Pope speaks about his impressions he had when he entered the Basilica of St. Peter, and he writes,
Our feet meet the earth in this place. There are so many walls, so many colonnades, yet we are not lost. If we find meaning and oneness, it is the floor that guides us. It joins the spaces of this great edifice, and joins the spaces within us, who walk aware of our weakness and defeat. Peter, you are the floor, that others may walk over you, not knowing where they go. You want to serve their feet that pass, as rock serves the hooves of sheep.
He tries to say that although church is very diverse, and although we can see many contradictory ideas within the church, there is something which is very basic. The fact that church was found by Jesus on the Apostle Peter, and here's the sign of unity and the sign of oneness. And there is another very beautiful poem, The Crypt, and Archbishop Wojtyła wrote,
We must go below the marble floor, with its generations of footsteps, and drill through the rock to find the man trampled by hooves of sheep.
And I think that this image of going below the marble floor is an invitation to discover more, to say, I can't be deceived by the world of appearances. I must discover in the church what she really is. I must go below. I must ask God to understand the mystery of the church. He says, look deeper. It's much, much more than you think. Regardless of all the problems the modern church experiences, regardless of all sexual scandals, regardless of the sinfulness of people, it's much, much more.
You're listening to Encounter with me, Wendy Barnaby. We're exploring the poetry of Pope John Paul II. As Karol Wojtyła, the Pope was already beginning to think about maturing and death when he was in his 40s.
Maturity, a descent to a hidden core. Layers fall from the imagination like leaves once locked in the trunk of their tree. The cells grow calm, though their sensitivity still stirs. The body in its own fullness reaches the shores of autumn. When we find ourselves at the shores of autumn, fear and love explode their contrary desires. Fear desiring the return to what was already existence, and still is. Love desiring the departure to the one in whom existence finds all its future. As we look toward the autumn shores, the struggle in us runs along the same divide which every man carries in him. Every man, if he cannot link his future with his body.
The Pope writes about two contradictory feelings everybody experiences, fear and love. We are afraid of death, but at the same time We love somebody, we love God, towards whom we go. And in a sense, we have to reconcile these two feelings in our lives. And he says that love will win, and love will help us to reach the one who is loved, God.
Christoph Sonneck. The Pope's own death is one of the subjects of his most recent poem, Roman Triptych. Journalist Jonathan Luxmore.
The title Roman Triptych can be interpreted actually in two ways. It can be seen as the three sides of a traditional medieval altar cloth. This was called a triptych. So in other words, it's a three-sided portrait, and the collection of poetry in Roman Triptych in fact consists of three parts, so it fits in with that. On the other hand, one can also see it as being the sort of trilogy or the triangle, if you like, of God, nature, and mankind. That is the sort of the second level of the triptych. And what the Pope is doing in this is he is exploring the relationship between the three, God, nature, and mankind. The sense of it is that in the first part he portrays man, as it were, in a state of innocence alongside the forces of nature and on the one side and God on the other, and deals with the quest of man for knowledge. He portrays knowledge, the sort of development of human consciousness, in a sort of familiar way as the stream, or the stream of knowledge, the stream of wisdom. And man is continually exploring the stream, going further up in search of its source. He is destined never to find the source because the source is uncoverable, but in the process of searching, he is enriched. He can drink from the stream and become rejuvenated. He can wash his face with the sort of refreshing water of the stream.
The undulating wood slopes down to the rhythm of mountain streams. If you want to find the source, you have to go up against the current, break through, search, don't yield. Let me wet my lips in spring water to feel its freshness, its life-giving freshness.
In the second and the third parts of Roman Triptych, he jumps ahead, as it were. He looks at the Sistine Chapel in Rome as an example of one of the greatest creations of man's artistic genius. And so he is moving from the simple metaphor of the stream of knowledge to one of the great works of art of human civilization, the Sistine Chapel. And he's looking at how this has been created, how man has channeled his genius, his creative ability into producing such a masterpiece.
I stand at the entrance of the Sistine Chapel. Perhaps all this might have been said more simply in the language of the book of Genesis. But the book awaits its illustration, and rightly. It awaited its Michelangelo. How much is spoken here on these walls, all this exuberance of vision, unleashed by human genius.
The Sistine Chapel is indeed an important venue for the Pope. It's the scene of one of the most dramatic moments of his life, his election as Pope on October 16, 1978.
The Pope's biographer, George Weigel.
As the Pope began to develop his remarkable theology of the human body, a new rereading of Catholic sexual morality, in the late 1970s and early 1980s, he found in the Sistine Chapel a whole new texture. He found in there what he called a sanctuary of the theology of the body. I remember when the completely renovated Sistine Chapel was rededicated in 1994, an American correspondent wrote that the Pope gave this beautiful sermon about the beauty of the nudes, despite his stern and conservative views on sexuality. Well, of course, this is to get it exactly backwards. The Pope is not at all bothered by the beauty of the human body, precisely because he believes, with the Catholic Church, that sexual love within the bond of committed and fruitful marriage is an icon of God himself. So that it's been for him that sort of place as well. Now perhaps not surprisingly, his mind turns in his 9th decade to his death and to the succession. And so his attention turns a little bit more from the ceiling to the Last Judgment, and he's reminding those charged with electing a pope that they are doing so before the gaze of Christ the Judge, and that they should allow themselves to be open to the spirit of creativity and responsibility that is evident in the fantastic achievement of Michelangelo.
The colours of the Sistine will then speak the word of the Lord. You are Peter, once heard by Simon, son of John. And so it will be once more when the time comes, after my death. During the conclave, Michelangelo must teach them. Do not forget, all is laid bare and revealed before the eyes of the Lord. You who see him, point to him. He will point him out.
In the third part, he moves the action, as it were, to the image of the Bible, of the biblical lands, and of Abraham, the story of Abraham, Abraham's encounter with God, how he recognizes the voice of God in the turbulence of the times and knows that it is the true voice of God, it is not the false voice of one of the many gods available to him.
Yet Abraham knew that it was he, the One. He recognized the voice. Today, then, we go back to these places because God passed by here when he came to Abraham. God came to Abraham, who believed.
At St. Peter's in Winchester, Maureen Marsh found the Pope's voice coming through this passage loud and strong.
Abraham, or Abram as he was then, always follows what God has asked of him. He's not wholly happy with what he's asked to do, particularly with God asking him to sacrifice his only son. But I love the analogy between Abraham, who I don't know about willingly, but he will obey God's word. And therefore God doesn't force that sacrifice upon him. And the analogy is between God the Father, who willingly offers his son for sacrifice, and he allows his son to be sacrificed. Any sacrifice that we are asked to make to God is in no way measurable with the sacrifice that God himself has made through love for us.
There is a moving moment in Roman Triptych where the Pope appears to be saying things which one might see as a sort of personal reflection on his own condition. He says, "What was alive is now dead. All that was beautiful is now the ugliness of devastation. And yet I do not die altogether. What is indestructible in me remains." One can see this as a sort of an affirmation, a great affirmation that despite the fragility, the frailness of his own condition, nevertheless the essential person who he was is still there. I think this is terrifically important because we see in the Pope an old man weighed down with illness, in many cases barely able to speak. Even when he speaks in his own native Polish, it's often very difficult to decipher what he's actually saying. It's sad to see this, and yet one might say that he is giving his final important message to the world in these final years of his own suffering, that in suffering, in age, in the finiteness of life, nevertheless there is hope and there is dignity. And there is meaning ultimately as well. One could say that he is living this out as a sort of visible symbol of it, which I think is terrifically important. There are a great many people, particularly now as people are living longer, who are condemned in their final years to live out a life of pain, of suffering, in which the world is asking whether their existence has sense, whether it has value in it. He is saying absolutely an affirmation that this suffering can be undergone even by somebody as important as the Pope, with the entire weight of the Church on his shoulders, nevertheless achieving ultimately great dignity and purpose in his life.
Jonathan Luxmore. As the Pope's life comes to an end, Wojciech Plazak finds him a very moving figure.
The last picture I have from his visit to Krakow in 2002, when he would want to go to sleep at 10 o'clock or after 10, after a very busy day, him being unwell, and the people outside the Archbishop's house where he was staying wouldn't go home, especially young people. They wouldn't go home, there were crowds there, and he would talk to them, not another sermon, discussion, and he would joke with them, and then he would say, "So it's good night," and they said good night. And then they would shout again. He would say, "I told you to be good night." And they said, "Not really. Please stay with us." There's that "Zostań z nami" phrase. And then he would say, this time, good night. It was heartbreaking, actually, if you ask me, when he had the main Krakow Common, Błonia, when he delivered his sermon, and on everybody's mind it was, is it the last time? Is it the last time? And the lesser man wouldn't say anything about it. He said, "Well, if anybody wants to know, I don't know. Nobody knows, God knows." He didn't avoid this subject. And that was shockingly touching. Let's call it like that. It was, actually. You could hear hairpin drop.
Now he moves me incredibly. He moves me through the suffering, which is so visible. And I'm incredibly proud that he doesn't hide that suffering away. And there again, I have tremendous respect for the fact that he still finds time to put some thoughts on paper for people like me. He shares his feelings. I think that's what, when I read his poetry, I am seeing a man talking to me, a wise man, who is not imposing his view of the world, of view of whatever he's talking about. It's somebody who wants to share, who invites me to listen to his perception of things. And all I can say is, I want to listen.
Ervas Lynn, ending this encounter. The reader was Peter Marinka. The Place Within, the poetry of Pope John Paul II, is published by Hutchinson in London. Roman Triptych is published by the Catholic Truth Society. Bolesław Toborski's English translation of Karol Wojtylja's plays is published by Random House. George Weigel's new book, Letters to a Young Catholic, is published by Basic Books. Thanks to Jill Drabble for technical help. The programme was produced by Wendy Barnaby.